Colonel Harrison spread the photographs across his desk, each one showing James and Sarah together at various locations around London. The evidence was undeniable and comprehensive. Someone had been following them for days, documenting their meetings with military precision. "Guardsman Wellington, this is far more serious than your previous protocol breach," the colonel said grimly. "You've been conducting an unauthorized relationship with a foreign civilian, lying about your whereabouts, falsifying sick reports, and neglecting your duties. This represents a complete breakdown in military discipline." James stood at attention, knowing that any explanation would sound like excuses. He had violated multiple regulations and betrayed the trust placed in him. The photos made their relationship look secretive and suspicious, even though their feelings for each other were genuine and innocent. "Sir, I take full responsibility for my actions," James said formally. "The civilian in question has done nothing wrong. She's a tourist who had no knowledge of military regulations. All responsibility lies with me." He was determined to protect Sarah from any consequences of their relationship. Colonel Harrison studied James carefully. He had seen promising young soldiers destroy their careers over relationships before, but this situation felt different somehow. The photographs showed genuine affection and connection, not the reckless behavior typical of soldiers who got involved with inappropriate partners. "Guardsman Wellington, you're facing possible court-martial, immediate discharge from service, and loss of all military benefits. Your actions have compromised palace security protocols and damaged the reputation of the Guard. Do you understand the severity of your situation?" James nodded, accepting that his military career was likely over. But surprisingly, he felt more sadness about losing Sarah than about losing his job. Their time together had shown him possibilities he had never considered, ways of living that went beyond following orders and maintaining rigid discipline. Meanwhile, Sarah had found James's message at her hotel. It was brief and formal, stating that he could no longer meet with her due to military obligations. The cold tone was so different from his usual warmth that Sarah immediately knew something was seriously wrong. She tried calling the palace, but was told that no information could be given about individual guards. Sarah spent a sleepless night worrying about James and wondering if she was responsible for destroying his career. She had encouraged him to take risks, to step outside his own comfort zone, without fully understanding what those risks might cost him. The guilt was overwhelming, but she also felt desperate to help him somehow. The next morning, Sarah made a decision that surprised even her. She put on her best dress, gathered all her courage, and walked directly to the main entrance of Buckingham Palace. She asked to speak with whoever was in charge of James Wellington's case, knowing it was probably futile but unable to leave London without trying to help. To her amazement, Colonel Harrison agreed to see her. He was curious about the American tourist who had caused such upheaval in his orderly military world. Sarah was escorted to his office, where she saw the photographs of her meetings with James spread across the desk. "Miss Mitchell, I presume," Colonel Harrison said, studying her carefully. "You've caused quite a stir in our organization. I'm curious to hear your perspective on this situation." His tone was professional but not unkind, giving Sarah hope that she might be able to help James somehow. Sarah took a deep breath and spoke from her heart. "Colonel Harrison, I need you to know that James is a good man who is trying to help someone in distress. He showed me kindness when I was frightened and alone, and yes, we became friends. But he never compromised palace security or shared any confidential information. He's being punished for showing basic human decency." The colonel was intrigued by Sarah's directness and her obvious concern for James's welfare. "Miss Mitchell, Guardsman Wellington violated multiple military regulations to spend time with you. His behavior has been completely unacceptable by military standards. How do you justify that?" "I don't justify it," Sarah replied honestly. "But I do understand it. James told me he spent 4 years following every rule perfectly, and what has it gotten him? He's 26 years old and has never made a real friend, never taken a personal risk, never acted on his own feelings. Maybe breaking a few rules. To connect with another human being isn't the worst thing a person can do." Colonel Harrison was quiet for a long moment, considering Sarah's words. He had dedicated his life to military service and understood the importance of discipline and protocol. But he also recognized that the best soldiers were those who maintained their humanity while serving their duty. "What are you asking me to do, Miss Mitchell?" the colonel finally asked. "I'm asking you to give James another chance," Sarah said. "I'm flying back to America tomorrow, so I won't be a distraction anymore. James made mistakes, but they were mistakes of the heart, not malicious acts. He deserves the opportunity to prove that he can still be a good soldier while remaining a good person." Colonel Harrison made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He called James into his office and offered him a choice. James could accept an immediate honorable discharge and leave the military with his record intact, or he could accept a transfer to a different posting with a formal reprimand that would remain on his permanent record. James chose the transfer, grateful for the unexpected opportunity to continue his military career. He never learned about Sarah's visit to Colonel Harrison, and the colonel never explained his change of heart. Some acts of compassion are meant to remain secret. Sarah returned to Ohio with a heart full of bittersweet memories and a new understanding of what it meant to take meaningful risks. James was transferred to a posting in Scotland, where he began to rebuild his military career while carrying lessons about courage and connection that would shape the rest of his life. Though separated by an ocean and different worlds, both Sarah and James were changed forever by their brief but profound connection. They had learned that sometimes the most important rules to break are the ones that keep us from becoming fully human. Their story became a reminder that genuine connections between people can transcend any protocol, and that acts of kindness and courage, no matter how small, can change lives in unexpected and beautiful ways. "I don't want this to end," Sarah said quietly as they prepared to part ways. "I know it's complicated, and I know we live in completely different worlds, but I've never felt this connected to someone so quickly." She looked down at her hands, afraid she was being too forward or putting pressure on him. James felt the same way, but the practical challenges seemed overwhelming. "I want to see you again too, more than anything, but I don't know how it could work. My schedule is completely controlled by the military, and I can't leave London without permission. Even meeting you today was a huge risk." Sarah had been thinking about this problem since the night before. "What if I extended my stay? I could change my flight and stay another week. We could meet during your off-duty hours, just as friends, getting to know each other." She held her breath, waiting for his response. The idea thrilled James, but it also terrified him. Spending more time with Sarah would mean deeper feelings and more complicated emotions. It would also mean more opportunities to get caught breaking regulations. But looking at her hopeful face, he realized he was willing to take those risks. "I get tomorrow afternoon off," James said carefully. "If you're serious about staying longer, maybe we could explore London together. I know places most tourists never see, quiet spots where we could talk without worrying about being recognized." His heart raced as he made the suggestion, knowing he was committing to something that could change his life forever. Sarah's face lit up with genuine joy. "I'll call the airline as soon as I get back to my hotel. This feels crazy and wonderful and scary all at the same time." She paused, then added more seriously, "But, James, I need you to be sure about this. I don't want you to lose your job because of me. If this becomes too risky, you have to promise you'll tell me." James appreciated her concern, but he had already made his decision. "I've spent 4 years playing it completely safe, and what do I have to show for it? A spotless record and an empty life. Maybe it's time I took some chances." He stood up from the bench, knowing he needed to get back to the palace before his break ended. That evening, Sarah successfully changed her flight and extended her hotel stay for another week. She called her school and arranged for a substitute teacher, claiming a family emergency. She felt guilty about the lie, but she couldn't bring herself to miss this opportunity to explore whatever was developing between her and James. James returned to his duties with mixed emotions. He was excited about spending time with Sarah, but he was also anxious about the risks involved. He had never defied authority so openly, and the feeling was both liberating and terrifying. He found himself distracted during evening duties, earning a sharp look from his sergeant. The next afternoon, James met Sarah at a small cafe in Camden, far from the tourist areas around the palace. Seeing her again confirmed that their connection was real and growing stronger. They spent hours walking through quiet neighborhoods, talking about everything and nothing, slowly learning about each other's lives and personalities. Sarah discovered that James was funny, thoughtful, and, surprisingly, well-read despite his military background. He had dreams of traveling, writing, and maybe teaching history someday. James found Sarah to be adventurous beneath her careful exterior, with a quick wit and genuine curiosity about the world. She challenged him to think differently about his choices and his future. Over the next few days, they met whenever James had free time. They visited hidden gardens, small museums, local pubs, and quiet spots along the Thames. Each meeting deepened their connection and made the thought of Sarah returning to America more painful for both of them. James began taking more risks to spend time with Sarah. He called in favors to switch duty schedules, claimed minor illnesses, to get time off, and even snuck out of the palace barracks after hours to meet her for late dinners. His behavior was becoming increasingly erratic by military standards, but he felt more alive than he had in years. Sarah was changing too. The careful teacher from Ohio was staying out late, taking spontaneous trips around London, and falling in love with someone whose life was completely incompatible with hers. She had never been so happy or so worried about the future at the same time. Their secret relationship continued for a week, with each day bringing deeper feelings and greater risks. James's fellow guards began to notice his distracted behavior and frequent absences. Sarah was spending money she didn't have and making promises to her job that she wasn't sure she could keep. Both knew that their situation was unsustainable, but neither wanted to be the first to acknowledge it. The inevitable crisis came during Sarah's second week in London. James had arranged to meet her for lunch but failed to show up at their usual cafe. Sarah waited for 2 hours, growing increasingly worried. She finally returned to her hotel to find a message that would change everything. James had been called into Colonel Harrison's office that morning for an emergency meeting. Someone had seen them together and reported it to palace security. The colonel had photos of their meetings, witness statements from other soldiers, and a detailed report of James's recent behavior changes. This time, there would be serious consequences that could end James's military career forever. James took a deep breath and walked toward the bench where Sarah was sitting. His heart pounded with each step, knowing he was about to cross another line that could change everything. When he was about 10 feet away, Sarah looked up from her camera and their eyes met. The recognition was instant and mutual. "It's you," Sarah said softly, her voice filled with surprise and something that might have been relief. She had wondered if she would ever see him again, and now here he was, looking completely different in civilian clothes, but with the same kind eyes that had helped her yesterday. "I saw you waiting at the palace this morning," James said, sitting down on the other end of the bench. "I wanted to make sure you were all right after yesterday. That must have been frightening for you." He kept his voice low and glanced around nervously, still worried about being seen by someone who might report back to his superiors. Sarah smiled, touched that he had been concerned enough to seek her out. "I'm Sarah Mitchell from Ohio in America. I never got to properly thank you for helping me yesterday. You probably saved me from being arrested or at least deeply embarrassed." She extended her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, James shook it. "James Wellington," he replied. "And you weren't going to be arrested. Palace security would have just moved you back to the tourist area. But you looked so scared, and I couldn't just stand there and do nothing." He realized he was still holding her hand and reluctantly let go. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both processing the surreal nature of their situation. Yesterday they had been separated by centuries of royal protocol and military tradition. Today they were just two people having a conversation by the river, as normal as any other tourists or locals in London. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said. "Don't you get in trouble for talking to tourists? I've been reading about palace guards, and it seems like the rules are pretty strict." She was curious about his world, but also worried that their conversation might cause problems for him. James nodded seriously. "I've already been formally warned about yesterday. Talking to you now could get me in much worse trouble. But honestly, I couldn't stop thinking about our encounter. It felt like something important happened even though it only lasted a few seconds." He looked out at the Thames, still amazed that he was being so open with someone he barely knew. Sarah felt a flutter of excitement mixed with concern. She was thrilled that their meeting had meant something to him too, but she didn't want to be responsible for him losing his job. Maybe we shouldn't be talking then. I don't want to cause you any more problems. It's my choice, James said firmly. I've followed every rule and regulation for 4 years. I've never stepped out of line, never questioned orders, never put my personal feelings ahead of my duty. But something about meeting you made me realize I've been living like a robot instead of a person. Sarah was moved by his honesty. She could see the internal conflict in his expression, the struggle between his sense of duty and his desire to connect with another human being. What's it like being a palace guard? Is it what you always wanted to do? James considered the question carefully. I joined the military when I was 18 because I needed direction in my life. The palace posting came later, and at first, I was proud of it. It's an honor to serve the royal family, and the discipline has been good for me. But lately, especially after yesterday, I've been wondering if I'm missing out on other things. What kind of things? Sarah asked gently, sensing that this was territory he rarely explored even with himself. Normal things, James said with a slight smile. Conversations like this one. Meeting new people. Making choices based on what I want instead of what regulations dictate. Yesterday, when I saw you in trouble, I acted on instinct for the first time in years. It felt terrifying and wonderful at the same time. Sarah understood more than she could express. She had always been cautious in her own life, teaching at the same school for 5 years, living in the same small town, following predictable routines. This trip to London was the most spontaneous thing she had ever done, and meeting James was pushing her even further outside her comfort zone. I've never done anything like this either, Sarah admitted. I'm usually very careful, very planned, but something about yesterday, about meeting you, made me feel more alive than I have in a long time. I know it sounds crazy since we barely know each other. James turned to look at her directly. It doesn't sound crazy at all. I felt the same thing. That's why I'm here, risking my career to have lunch with a tourist. He laughed, but there was nervousness in it. My commanding officer would probably have me committed if he knew what I was thinking. They talked for another hour, sharing stories about their lives, their dreams, and their fears. Sarah told James about her teaching job, her small apartment in Ohio, and her love of travel and photography. James talked about growing up in a military family, his struggles with feeling trapped by expectations, and his secret desire to see more of the world beyond palace walls. As their time together came to an end, both realized they were facing an impossible situation. Sarah would be returning to America in 2 days, and James was bound by military obligations that would make any relationship extremely difficult, if not impossible. Yet neither of them wanted to say goodbye. Colonel Harrison leaned back in his chair, considering his options. James had served with distinction, never missing a duty or showing any sign of unprofessional behavior. The incident was unusual, but the colonel had to admit that helping a distressed civilian wasn't the worst kind of protocol breach he had dealt with over the years. Guardsman Wellington, your record speaks for itself, the colonel finally said. However, protocol exists for important reasons. The public expects our guards to maintain their composure and dignity at all times. What you did this morning created a spectacle and drew unwanted attention to our operations. James accepted the reprimand quietly, knowing he deserved whatever punishment was coming. He had known the risks when he chose to help Sarah, but he couldn't bring himself to regret his decision. Something about that moment had felt more important than following rules, though he couldn't explain why. That said, Colonel Harrison continued, I've reviewed the witness statements and video footage. The tourist was clearly in genuine distress, and your assistance prevented what could have been a more serious incident. You handled the situation with discretion and got her to safety quickly. For that, I'm giving you a formal warning, rather than more severe consequences. James felt a wave of relief wash over him. A formal warning was serious, but it wouldn't end his career or result in a transfer. He would remain at Buckingham Palace, though he knew he would be watched more closely for any future protocol violations. He thanked the colonel and left the office, grateful that his moment of compassion hadn't cost him everything. Meanwhile, Sarah had returned to her hotel room and was looking through the photos from her morning at the palace. Most of them captured the ceremony beautifully, but there were several shots that showed her unexpected encounter with James. In one photo, she could clearly see the concern in his eyes as he looked at her. In another, she had captured the exact moment he whispered to her, his professional mask slipping just enough to reveal his humanity. Sarah found herself staring at these photos for hours. She had traveled to London expecting to see historical sites and take tourist pictures, but instead, she had experienced something that felt much more personal and meaningful. The guard's kindness had touched something deep inside her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that their brief connection had been significant. That evening, Sarah decided to research more about the palace guards. She learned about their training, their daily routines, and the strict codes of conduct they were expected to follow. The more she read, the more she realized how much James had risked by speaking to her. He could have lost his job, his military rank, and his livelihood just for showing concern for a stranger's well-being. Sarah also discovered that guard duty schedules were rotated regularly, meaning James might not be at the palace gates again for weeks or even months. The thought that she might never see him again filled her with an unexpected sadness. She had only 3 more days left in London before her flight back to Ohio, and she didn't even know his name. The next morning, Sarah found herself back at Buckingham Palace despite her plans to visit Westminster Abbey. She told herself she was just hoping to get better photos, but deep down she knew she was looking for James. She studied each guard's face carefully, trying to recognize the kind eyes that had helped her the day before. After 2 hours of watching the guards, Sarah realized that James was not among them. Disappointed but not surprised, she finally headed toward Westminster Abbey as originally planned. As she walked away from the palace, she didn't notice the figure watching her from a window high above the courtyard. James had spotted Sarah from his post inside the palace building. He was assigned to interior duty for the next week as an indirect consequence of yesterday's incident. Watching her wait hopefully by the gates stirred feelings he didn't fully understand. He found himself wondering about her life, where she came from, and what had brought her to London. During his lunch break, James made an impulsive decision that surprised even him. He changed out of his uniform into civilian clothes and walked toward the tourist areas around the palace. He told himself he was just taking a normal lunch walk, but he knew he was hoping to see Sarah again. James searched through the crowds near Westminster Abbey, Hyde Park, and the other popular attractions close to the palace. He felt foolish for looking for someone he had spoken to for less than a minute, someone whose name he didn't even know. But something about their encounter had left him feeling different, more aware of the world outside his military routine. Just as he was about to give up and return to the palace, James spotted a familiar figure sitting on a bench near the Thames. Sarah was alone, looking through photos on her camera with a thoughtful expression. She seemed peaceful but also a little melancholy, as if she was processing something important. James hesitated, knowing that approaching her could lead to even more serious consequences if anyone from the palace saw them together. But watching her from a distance, he realized that their brief encounter had affected her too. She had returned to the palace looking for something, just as he was now standing, here debating whether to risk everything for a conversation with a stranger. "Are you all right?" James whispered, his voice barely audible above the murmur of the crowd. Those 3 simple words broke every rule he had been taught, but he couldn't stop himself. The concern in his voice was genuine, and Sarah felt her panic begin to ease. Sarah nodded quickly, not trusting herself to speak. She was amazed that this guard, who was supposed to be like a statue, was actually showing concern for her well-being. She expected him to be angry or stern, but instead, she saw compassion in his eyes. This wasn't how royal guards were supposed to behave, and she knew it. The other guards in the formation remained perfectly still, but Sarah noticed a few quick glances in their direction. James knew he was being watched by his fellow soldiers, by his commanding officers, and by hundreds of tourists with cameras. Yet he found himself caring more about this stranger's safety than about following protocol. "Step back slowly," James whispered again, giving Sarah the guidance she desperately needed. "Just move toward the barrier on your left, you'll be fine." His words were calm and reassuring, like a friend helping her navigate a difficult situation rather than a guard enforcing royal rules. Sarah followed his instructions, carefully stepping backward while maintaining eye contact with James. She could feel the curious stares of other tourists and the growing tension in the air. Camera flashes went off around them as people realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. This interaction was definitely not part of the usual ceremony. As Sarah reached the safety of the tourist barrier, she mouthed the words, "Thank you," to James. He couldn't respond verbally, but she saw the slightest nod of his head, so subtle that only she would notice it. This tiny gesture meant everything to her. It confirmed that their brief connection had been real, not just her imagination. The ceremony continued, but neither Sarah nor James could focus on anything else. Sarah remained at the barrier, her camera forgotten in her hands as she watched James return to his rigid posture. She was amazed by his ability to slip back into his role so seamlessly, as if their interaction had never happened. But she could tell from the way he occasionally glanced in her direction that he was thinking about it too. James struggled to concentrate on the remaining ceremony. He had never broken protocol before, and he couldn't understand what had come over him. His training was supposed to make him immune to distractions, yet this young tourist had somehow reached past all his defenses in a matter of seconds. He tried to convince himself it was just a moment of weakness, but deep down he knew it was something more. When the ceremony finally ended, Sarah watched as the guards began to march away. She hoped James might look back at her one more time, but he maintained perfect military discipline as he disappeared into the palace grounds. She felt a strange mixture of gratitude and disappointment. Their encounter had lasted less than a minute, but it had felt incredibly meaningful. Sarah spent the rest of the day exploring London, but she couldn't stop thinking about the guard who had shown her such unexpected kindness. She wondered about his life, his background, and whether he ever thought about the tourists he encountered during ceremonies. She had planned to visit several other attractions, but found herself walking past Buckingham Palace again and again, hoping for another glimpse of him. Meanwhile, James was facing questions from his superior officers. Several people had photographed and filmed the incident, and word had quickly spread through the palace staff. Breaking protocol during a public ceremony was a serious matter, and James knew he would have to explain his actions. He had never been in trouble during his 4 years of service, which might work in his favor, but he also knew the rules were taken very seriously. Colonel Harrison, James's commanding officer, called him into his office that afternoon. James stood at attention, preparing for the worst possible consequences. He could be demoted, transferred, or even dismissed from service. The royal household took protocol breaches very seriously, especially when they occurred in full view of the public and media. "Guardsman Wellington," Colonel Harrison began, his voice stern but not unkind. "I understand there was an incident during this morning's ceremony. A tourist appeared to be in distress, and you chose to assist her rather than maintaining your position. Is this correct?" James confirmed the facts, accepting full responsibility for his actions. He explained that the tourist seemed genuinely frightened and in need of help, and that his instinct to assist someone in trouble had overridden his training. He didn't mention the strange connection he had felt with Sarah, or how her eyes had seemed to communicate so much in such a brief moment. The colonel studied James carefully. He had seen many young soldiers struggle with the demands of palace duty, but James had always been exemplary. This was completely out of character for him, which made the situation even more puzzling. There was clearly more to this story than a simple breach of protocol, but the colonel wasn't sure he wanted to know what it was. Sarah Mitchell had dreamed of visiting Buckingham Palace her entire life. The 28-year-old teacher from Ohio had saved every penny for 3 years to make this trip to London possible. She clutched her camera tightly as she approached the iconic gates, her heart racing with excitement. The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace grounds as tourists began gathering for the changing of the guard ceremony. Sarah positioned herself near the front of the crowd, determined to capture the perfect photograph. She had studied the timing, read every travel guide, and even practiced her camera settings the night before in her small hotel room. As the ceremony began, Sarah was mesmerized by the precision and grandeur. The guards moved with military precision, their red tunics and tall bearskin hats creating a spectacular display. She snapped photo after photo, completely absorbed in the moment. The crowd around her pushed closer, everyone eager to witness this centuries-old tradition. Among the guards stood James Wellington, a 26-year-old soldier who had been serving at the palace for 4 years. Today felt different for him somehow. He had performed this ceremony hundreds of times, but something in the air made him more aware of his surroundings. Perhaps it was the unusual warmth of the October morning, or maybe it was the way the sunlight hit the palace walls. James had always taken pride in his ability to remain perfectly still and focused during ceremonies, no matter what distractions occurred around him. Tourists often tried to get reactions from the guards, taking silly photos or making jokes. He had learned to block out everything except his duty. But today, his attention kept drifting to a young woman in the crowd with curly brown hair and an infectious smile. Sarah was completely captivated by the ceremony. She watched as the guards marched in perfect formation, their movements synchronized like a well-rehearsed dance. She had read about the strict rules and protocols that governed their behavior, how they were trained never to break character or acknowledge the crowd. This made the ceremony feel even more special and mysterious to her. As the ceremony reached its climax, Sarah stepped forward slightly to get a better angle for her photographs. She wanted to capture the moment when the guards would salute, knowing this would be the highlight of her entire trip. Her excitement was building as she raised her camera, ready to preserve this memory forever. The crowd behind her surged forward suddenly, caught up in the excitement of the moment. Someone bumped into Sarah hard, causing her to stumble forward. She tried to regain her balance but found herself moving closer to the guard line than any tourist should ever be. Her heart pounded as she realized she was breaking one of the most important rules of royal protocol. James saw the young woman stumbling toward his position. His training told him to remain motionless, to let the palace security handle any disturbances. But something about her genuine distress and the look of panic in her eyes made him hesitate. She wasn't trying to cause trouble or make a scene like some tourists did. She was clearly just an innocent visitor who had found herself in an impossible situation. Sarah looked up and found herself face to face with one of the guards. She could see his eyes beneath the shadow of his bearskin hat, and she was struck by how kind they looked. She expected to be roughly escorted away by security, to be embarrassed in front of hundreds of tourists, maybe even arrested for breaking royal protocol. Instead, she found herself frozen in place, staring into the eyes of this mysterious guard. The moment stretched between them, lasting only seconds but feeling like an eternity. Other tourists began to notice what was happening. Some started taking pictures, while others whispered among themselves. Sarah knew she should move away immediately, but something about this guard's presence made her feel unexpectedly calm, despite the chaos of the situation. James made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Instead of maintaining his rigid posture and allowing security to handle the situation, he did something that went against every rule in the Royal Protocol Handbook. He took a small step towards Sarah, closing the gap between them even further, and in the softest voice possible he whispered something that only she could hear.